There is a hollow in the North Carolina mountains where, on one cold October morning in 1851, 31 children walked between two ridgelines and vanished. 4 came back 6 days later. They didn't speak, they didn't cry, and the hair at their temples had turned white, as if they'd aged decades in less than a week. The other 27 were never found. Not a shoe, not a scrap of cloth, not a single bone. For a century and a half, the story of what happened in that hollow was buried on purpose, by a county that called it a weather accident, by a church that called it an act of God, and by 4 traumatized survivors who refused to say a single word about it until the last of them died alone in a mental institution in 1928. His final sentence, spoken after 57 years of total silence, was 3 words that would connect his death to a stranger's on the other side of the same building, at the exact same minute. If that doesn't send a chill down your spine, stick around, because it gets far stranger. And if stories like this are your thing, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. This is the story of Ashcombe Hollow. And unlike most legends this old, this one isn't built on rumor. It's built on a diary. A real, handwritten diary that sat hidden for 120 years before a graduate student cracked it open, and then quietly tried to destroy what he found inside. Let's go back to the beginning. In the early 1850s, the settlement of Ashcombe wasn't really a town. It was a scattering of maybe 40 farmhouses tucked into a fold of the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 30 miles from the nearest real town of Morganton. There was a single meeting hall that served as both church and schoolhouse, a blacksmith, a grist mill on the creek, a general store run by a widow. The families here were the descendants of Scots-Irish and German settlers who'd come down from Pennsylvania 2 generations earlier, and they lived the way mountain communities lived back then, farming tobacco and corn, raising hogs in the woods, distilling whiskey the tax collectors hadn't bothered to climb the ridge for yet. These were people who didn't forget things easily. Not debts, not insults, and not the old warnings passed down about a particular stretch of land above the creek. About 1.25 miles east of the meeting hall, a narrow path ran along the north bank of the creek before cutting south into a hollow between 2 ridges. On the one surviving map from the era, it's labeled with the family name of the first settlers, but locally, everyone called it something else, a rough English translation of a Cherokee phrase whose meaning had been passed down imperfectly through the generations. The closest anyone could translate it was, "the place where the ground remembers." The Cherokee had been forcibly removed from that region back in 1838, and whatever detailed knowledge they'd had about that hollow left with them, except for the warnings that lingered. Children weren't supposed to go up there after dark. Hunters avoided it once autumn set in. Even the women, who gathered wild herbs along nearly every other shaded creek bank in the region, stayed away from this one. One farmer, who'd settled the land nearest the mouth of the hollow back in the 1820s, had nailed a wooden cross to a beech tree at the trailhead. He never fully explained why. All he'd say was that an old German settler, one of the very first in the valley, had pulled him aside on the day he bought the land and told him, in broken English, "Don't cross this mark at dusk, and don't ever send a child across it alone. Not for any reason, not for any price." That old settler died without saying more, and the farmer who inherited the warning waited years before finally putting up that cross, and only after a stretch of nights where the wind coming down out of the hollow woke him again and again, until he couldn't stand lying awake and listening to it anymore. Now, into this settlement, in the spring of 1850, came a 24-year-old schoolteacher named Evangeline Truitt. She was smart, composed, and, by the standards of a rural 1850s mountain community, remarkably self-assured. She didn't defer to the fathers of her older students the way her predecessor had. She didn't soften her speech for the visiting preachers. One local farmer wrote to his brother that she was an educated woman in the way that makes a mountain man nervous, meaning she simply knew things he didn't, and made no attempt to hide it. She boarded above the general store, was engaged to a seminary student back east, and kept a small leather diary that she filled most nights by candlelight. That diary is the reason we know anything at all about what happened next. By the fall of 1851, Evangeline was teaching 33 children, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. There was the oldest boy, a serious, steady 14-year-old who read scripture aloud to his younger sisters each night. There was the youngest, a 6-year-old girl who carried a rag doll everywhere, even during lessons. There were 2 sets of twins. There was a boy with a crippling fear of water, and a girl with a stammer that Evangeline had been tutoring privately after school. 33 names, 33 futures. Until the morning, everything changed. On October 21st, 1851, 2 of those children stayed home sick. That left 31 who filed into the schoolhouse that Tuesday morning for what began as an ordinary day. Here's where the diary becomes essential, because it tells us Evangeline had a very specific reason for what she did next, and it wasn't spontaneous at all. 3 days earlier, a traveling naturalist, a Bavarian-born botany professor, had passed through the settlement and stayed 2 nights at the store. Over supper, he'd described a rare species of orchid, one the old Cherokee had a name for that he couldn't quite pronounce, which bloomed in shaded mountain coves in late October. He believed it might grow somewhere near the settlement, and he showed Evangeline a pressed specimen from his collection. Greenish-white, veined with a purple so dark it looked black by candlelight, with petals that had an almost lip-like curve to them. Evangeline was captivated. She decided to walk into the hollow to search for the flower, combined with a lesson on autumn foliage, would be a richer education than another week stuck inside with the primer. What her diary makes clear, and what nobody else in the settlement seemed to realize at the time, is that she didn't know about the cross on the beech tree. She didn't know the old name for the hollow. She didn't know about the German settlers' warning, or the farmers' sleepless nights, or any of the quiet dread the community carried about that particular fold in the mountains. Nobody warned her. Maybe nobody thought to. Maybe nobody imagined she'd go in that far. The morning of the walk was clear and cold. Classic late October mountain weather. Frost pooled in the shadows, but a thin, pale sun was out. The children, thrilled at the break from routine, were let loose to run ahead on the path, told only to stay within earshot. Evangeline walked at the rear with her 2 oldest students. They passed a cornfield around 9 that morning, where the local farmer was pulling the last ears from the stalks. He raised a hand in greeting as they passed. He never thought to ask how far they meant to go. Shortly after, they passed the beech tree with the cross. And that's where Evangeline's diary goes silent for 6 days. The alarm wasn't raised until nearly dusk. The widow who ran the store assumed at first that the outdoor lesson had simply run long. By mid-afternoon, she grew uneasy, checked the empty schoolhouse, and sent for help. The farmer who'd waved to them that morning rode up the hollow himself, calling their names. The hollow swallowed his voice rather than echoing it back. When he reached the clearing where a spring bubbled up through mossy stones, he found small cloth lunch bundles folded neatly on a flat rock, and apple cores scattered across the moss. No children. He didn't stay long. He later said the clearing gave him a feeling like standing too close to the edge of a cliff in the dark, and he rode out faster than he meant to, without looking back. By full dark that night, 15 men with lanterns and hunting dogs were combing the hollow. By midnight 40, by the next morning, the entire settlement had emptied into the woods, and riders had been sent to fetch the county sheriff. The blacksmith didn't light his forge for 6 days. The mill stopped turning. The local minister sat on a log at the edge of that clearing for 2 straight days, convinced that if he prayed hard enough, some sign would show him where the children had gone. On the 3rd day, he said he heard what sounded like a child laughing somewhere up the slope. When he called out, the laughter stopped. Nothing appeared. He sat back down and wept for the first time since his wife had died over a decade earlier. What the search parties documented, across 3 separate written accounts, including one from the school teacher's own fiancé, who eventually traveled from Princeton to investigate, all agreed on the same core details. The children had made it about 3/4 of a mile into the hollow, to a small clearing where a spring rose through mossy stone. There, the sign simply stopped. Lunch bundles, still neatly tied, a small pair of shoes set side by side, as if their owner had slipped them off to rest, a pale blue hair ribbon, an unbroken slate pencil. And then, nothing. No trail leading away, no footprints in the damp soil beyond that point. The search dogs wouldn't cross into the clearing at all. 2 of them lay down at its edge and refused to be coaxed forward, One bit the man who tried to physically drag it across. The search dragged on for 11 days. Men combed the ridgelines, beat the underbrush, fired muskets to signal each other across the terrain. One searcher, a father who had lost his own 10-year-old daughter that day, found a strange little cairn in a rock cleft about a quarter-mile from the clearing. 11 small stones, stacked deliberately the way a child might stack them, in a spot that had been empty just weeks before. He tore it apart with his bare hands. Underneath, he found a braid of hair tied with red wool. It was his daughter's. He took it home and burned it that same night, unable to tell anyone what he'd found, a secret he carried until he confessed it to his wife on his own deathbed, nearly 3 decades later. 31 children and their teacher had walked into a clearing barely half an acre wide, 3/4 of a mile from a settlement of 40 families, and simply ceased to exist. No blood, no struggle, no disturbed earth. The spring kept flowing exactly as it always had. If this is giving you chills already, imagine being one of the parents standing at the edge of those woods for 11 straight days. And we're just getting started, because what happened on day 6 is the part this community spent the next 50 years trying to erase from memory. Grief in that settlement didn't look like wailing or mourning bells. It looked like silence. Women cooked and quietly delivered food to the grieving households. Men sat on porches and said nothing. When a prayer service was held a few days later, not one family of a missing child attended. Not a single one. Neighbors said the mother of the oldest boy sat on her front step for an entire day, refusing to eat, refusing to go inside, insisting only that a mother knows when her child is coming home, and that hers was coming. By the following week, the search had all but ended. The sheriff rode back to town, and the settlement, according to the minister's own letters, became a place where nobody could look each other in the eye anymore, because to meet someone else's gaze was to see the same emptiness staring back that you carried in yourself. Then, 6 days after the disappearance, at dawn, a woman hauling water from the creek saw movement through heavy fog on the far bank. 4 children were standing knee-deep in the water, facing upstream, completely still. They didn't respond when she called out. She waded in and took the nearest child by the arm, a 9-year-old boy. He didn't look at her. His hair, which had been brown, was now streaked white at both temples. The other 3 were an 11-year-old girl, an 8-year-old boy, and the oldest of the group, the 14-year-old who'd read scripture to his sisters, now missing 2 front teeth that had been in his mouth 6 days earlier. She led all 4 back to the settlement. None of them resisted. None of them shivered, despite the cold water. Their bare feet showed no cuts, despite days presumably spent in rough terrain. And most unsettling of all, their clothes, the same clothes they'd worn into the hollow, were spotless. Not torn, not dirty. Clean, as if freshly laundered and pressed. The woman who found them said that detail haunted her more than anything else until the day she died decades later. Clean clothes, after 6 days lost in the woods. The 4 were returned to their families and separated into different homes. For 2 full days before a doctor could arrive from town, they didn't speak. They ate only when food was placed directly in front of them, without any real appetite. They slept only when led to bed. They didn't respond to their own names, or the names of their parents and siblings. When one mother held her son's hand, wept, and begged him to tell her where the others had gone, he eventually turned his head toward her, and she said afterward that she instantly wished he hadn't. Whatever was looking out through his eyes, she said, was not her son. She knew in that moment he wasn't coming back, no matter how long she waited. When the doctor finally arrived, a physician trained in Philadelphia with a reputation for handling unusual cases, he examined all 4 children and found them in what he called perfect physical health. No injuries, no signs of exposure or starvation. Their weight matched exactly what their families reported before the disappearance. The white streaks in their hair were oddly uniform, about an inch wide on each side, almost as if painted on. Their eyes tracked light, he noted, but not faces. Their pulses ran unusually slow. In the oldest boy's case, dangerously so for a boy his age. They didn't flinch at a bright lamp held to their faces. They didn't react when his assistant fired a pistol in the next room as an unannounced test, something the doctor later said he deeply regretted doing. In his private notes, he wrote that these children weren't catatonic in any clinical sense he recognized. They were, in his words, somewhere else. And whatever had taken them there had sent something back in their place that didn't quite know how to be a child anymore. Over the following months, 3 of the 4 slowly began to return to themselves, each in strange, halting, incomplete ways, each carrying scars that never fully healed. One would refuse to sleep without a lamp lit, refuse to eat apples, refuse to walk in the direction of the mountains for the rest of his life. Another spoke for years afterward, cryptically, about something she called the singing, always with the definite article, as if it were a shared secret her own mother should already understand. The third fell into a pattern that would define the rest of his life, normal through spring and summer, and then, every single autumn, sliding into a silence that lasted until the following year. He was eventually institutionalized after being found, decades later, standing at the abandoned trailhead with his hands pressed against that same beech tree. But the fourth, the oldest boy, the one who used to read scripture aloud with such steady confidence, never came back at all. He lived the rest of his life without speaking a single word, without responding to his own name, without any diagnosable illness that multiple doctors over more than a decade could identify. His mother cared for him like an infant for the rest of her life, dressing him, feeding him, reading Bible verses to him each night, even though he never once showed any sign of hearing them. His father couldn't bear to look at him, and eventually moved out to the barn. When both parents died within a month of each other during an influenza outbreak in the 1860s, he was taken in by an uncle, and when that uncle died as well, he was committed to a state hospital, where he would remain for the next 57 years. The staff called him simply the Silent Man. He ate what was placed in front of him. He walked when he was walked. He never spoke, never wrote, never once acknowledged the presence of another human being in any detectable way, not even his own reflection in a mirror. Except for one thing. Every single year, on October 21st, between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, he would stand at his window and face east. Exactly 2 hours, without fail, for 57 consecutive years. Then he'd sit back down and return to silence. He died in early 1928, at 91 years old, the oldest patient in that hospital. According to the nurse on duty that day, at 6 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, his eyes opened for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, and he spoke 3 words in a perfectly clear voice: "They are coming." Then he closed his eyes and died. Now here's where the story stops being a simple tragedy and becomes something else entirely. Because the question of what actually happened in that clearing consumed everyone who touched it. It drove the schoolteacher's fiancé to write a 400-page manuscript that's never been published. It drove the town's minister to preach a sermon every single year on the anniversary, until his own death, begging his congregation to search their souls for a sin he could never quite name. It drove the examining doctor to spend 20 years chasing a paper he never finished. It drove the farmer who'd nailed up that warning cross to slowly lose his mind through the 1850s. Until he was found hanged in his own barn in 1861, with a note pinned to his shirt reading only, "I should have cut down the tree. I should have cut it down years ago. Forgive me." And it drove one more person, more than a century later, to a discovery so unsettling he ultimately tried to burn the evidence. That diary, Evangeline's diary, resurfaced in 1971, passed down through 3 generations of women in the same family until it landed in the hands of a graduate student researching frontier education in the southern Appalachians. He assumed, at first, that it would be a straightforward historical document. It was not. The early entries were exactly what you'd expect: reflections on her students, letters to her fiancé, notes on Sunday sermons. But by the summer of 1851, the entries take a turn. She'd begun taking solitary Saturday walks to clear her head, first along the creek, then up the ridge, and eventually, by August, into the hollow itself. Her first entry mentioning the hollow, dated August 9th, describes her curiosity about the cross on the beech tree, and a certain condescension toward what she assumed was simple rural superstition. A week later, she walked past that tree for the first time, all the way to the clearing at the spring. She wrote about the beauty of the light filtering through the trees, the icy bite of the spring water, and about a sound, At first she assumed it was wind, or distant farmers talking somewhere beyond the ridge. She sat for nearly an hour and walked home in good spirits. A week after that, she returned. The sound was there again, and this time she noted it didn't have the rhythm of ordinary conversation. It had the rhythm of singing, though she couldn't place any actual tune. She stayed nearly 2 hours. When she finally left, she described an overwhelming sensation of having forgotten something important, a pull to turn back that lasted for hundreds of yards down the trail. Through September, her visits increased, 3 times a week by the end of the month. Her language shifts too. What starts as an odd sound becomes the music of the cove, then simply the singing, referenced with the casual familiarity of an inside joke. She speculated it might be a natural phenomenon, tied to water moving through rock, and mentioned wanting to consult a scientist about it, which is exactly when the traveling botanist happened to arrive in town. But here's the detail her fiancé never knew, and the graduate student almost couldn't bring himself to believe. She had already brought children into that hollow, multiple times, before the fatal walk. On October 6th, she brought her 2 oldest students to the clearing, specifically to test whether the sound was audible to anyone besides herself. Both of them heard it. One was unsettled and asked to leave. The other, the boy who would later become the silent man, sat transfixed for a full hour and asked, in a voice she described as dreamy, if they could come back. A week later, she brought 4 children. One heard the singing and laughed. Another, the girl with the stammer, heard it too, and asked, without a trace of her usual stammer, whether the singers were inside the rock. When Evangeline told her it was just an echo with a natural explanation, the girl asked a second question that Evangeline never recorded an answer to. If they're not inside the rock, then where are they? Her final entry, written the night before the fatal walk, is the one the graduate student would later describe as the true center of the entire mystery. In it, she confesses she can't tell whether the sound is the singing of children or of something that has simply learned to sound like children. She recounts a conversation with the visiting botanist, who dismissed the sound as a known acoustic phenomenon, certain rock formations that produce voice-like tones under specific wind and pressure conditions, something he claimed the Cherokee had long recognized and marked, warning only against visiting at dusk, when the ear becomes less reliable and the mind more prone to suggestion. She admits she never told him she'd already brought children into the hollow twice. She admits the oldest boy had told her the singing had words in it, words specifically asking the children to come closer, but only the children, because the voice wouldn't speak to her. She was too old. She admits the stammering girl said the voices came from beneath the stones and that they sounded lonely. Her final line, written at 11 at night with the wind rattling the eaves, says she thought, just for a moment, that she heard the singing again, even though she was over a mile from the hollow, which, she wrote, was of course impossible. That's the last entry. The rest of the diary is blank pages. Her fiancé later found her boarding room untouched, bed made, hairbrush and mirror in place, and the diary lying open on the table, not to that final entry, but to the page describing her very first walk to the spring back in August. He never explained why. He never could. When the graduate student, Hollister Vance, traveled to the site himself in 1972 with a geologist, they found exactly what the botanist had described. Deep beneath that clearing runs a formation of limestone laced with narrow fissures. Under the right conditions, wind from a certain direction, a creek running full, falling air pressure, those fissures genuinely do produce sound, a continuous soft tone in a frequency range that the human ear, especially a child's ear, interprets as distant voices. Depending on the weather, it can resemble singing, murmured conversation, or even the faint crying of infants. It's a real, documented phenomenon found in several spots across the southern Appalachians, and on its own, it isn't dangerous. But Vance didn't stop there. Digging through county records, he found the 1851 disappearance wasn't an isolated event at all. It was the worst entry in a long, quiet pattern. A hunter vanished in that hollow back in 1814. 2 siblings went missing from a nearby farm in 1833, were found a week later silent and unresponsive, and both died within the year. A traveling peddler disappeared in 1844, his cart found abandoned at the same beech tree, horses still harnessed. A mill hand vanished in 1829. the very year the warning cross went up. A pair of brothers went hunting in that hollow, back in 1801. Only one came out, and he hanged himself 3 weeks later. In total, Vance documented 17 separate incidents between 1789 and 1850, clustering in late autumn, following wet summers, and most disturbingly, spiking in years when the settlement's population had grown, as if the pattern responded not to chance but to opportunity. In Smithsonian Ethnographic Archives, Vance found a 19th-century researcher's note on a Cherokee prohibition tied to this exact location, one that had been dismissed at the time as local folklore. The rule wasn't a blanket ban on visiting the clearing. It was far more specific: never bring children there in numbers greater than one at a time, never more. Evangeline brought 2, then 4, then 31. Vance came to believe, and it's the theory his own academic advisor warned him never to publish, that the sound in that clearing wasn't the danger itself. It was bait. Something in that place used the sound to draw prey close, and the prey it preferred, according to both the old prohibition and the 2-century pattern of disappearances, was children. His strongest piece of evidence came from the state hospital records themselves. When he got permission to review them in 1974, he discovered that at the exact moment the silent man spoke his final words and died, a woman on a completely different ward, committed in 1917, silent and unresponsive for her entire decade there, also died. Her official cause of death was listed as natural causes. But the ward journal noted that at 3 in the afternoon that same day, she'd opened her eyes for the first time in years and spoken the exact same 3 words: "They are coming." Then she closed her eyes and died. Vance traced her backward. She'd first appeared in Asheville in 1893, arriving on foot, alone, dressed in the remnants of a child's dress, despite being a grown woman in her late 40s. She couldn't provide her name, so the boarding house that took her in simply gave her one to write in their ledger. The only possession she carried was a single pressed flower, greenish-white, veined in a purple so dark it looked black in low light. A species that has never been catalogued by any botanist. The exact species the traveling naturalist had shown Evangeline in her boarding room the night before the walk. Vance kept tracing: dental records, a distinctive birthmark on her left wrist, noted by the admitting doctor in 1917, a birthmark that matched, almost exactly, a description Evangeline had written in her diary months before the disappearance, describing her youngest student, the 6-year-old girl with the rag doll, the one whose doll was found on the flat rock because she'd wandered further into the clearing than any of the others. That 6-year-old had walked into the hollow in 1851 and walked back out 42 years later, in 1893, at the age of 48, carrying a flower that shouldn't exist. She lived another 35 years in near total silence, and she died at the exact same minute as the boy who'd once read scripture to his sisters, speaking his exact same final words. Vance's research ends there. In a private letter to his advisor, he wrote that he felt he was staring through a window into something that was never meant to be looked at, and that he'd started dreaming, night after night, about a clearing he had only physically visited once. He destroyed his manuscript in 1978. The only surviving copy was a forgotten carbon duplicate, which sat untouched in a box for over 40 years until it was sold at an estate sale in 2019 for $12. The historian who bought it has never published it. When asked why, she said simply that she believes the clearing is still there, the spring still runs, and in the right weather, the fishers still sing. One last thread remains. In 2006, a hiker on the Appalachian Trail, which passes within a few miles of where the old settlement once stood, reported to a park ranger that he'd gotten disoriented in heavy fog, wandered off trail, and stumbled onto a small clearing with a spring. He said he heard what sounded like children singing, though he could see no one. He sat on a flat rock beside the spring for what he was certain was about 15 minutes. When he finally found his way back to the trail, 2 separate groups of hikers passed him heading north, and each one gave him a different date. When he reached the ranger station, he learned that 4 full days had passed since he'd stepped off the trail. Days he has no memory of. In his pack was a small pressed flower, greenish-white, veined in dark purple. He had no memory of picking it. That flower was never identified. The ranger who filed the report retired in 2011. The paperwork still sits in a cabinet at that station, and within a year of that hike, the man's hair had gone white at the temples. He lives in Ohio now. He doesn't return phone calls. To this day, in a small private cemetery in western North Carolina, there's a stone marker with no name on it, just a date, October 21st, 1851, and a single word, lost. A descendant of the original settlement paid to have it placed there in 1951, exactly 1 century after that morning walk, because she felt someone finally needed to remember what her family, her county, and her country had spent generations trying to forget. She told the mason who carved it that she'd been haunted her whole life by a feeling she couldn't quite explain, one that always grew strongest in late autumn, a sense that somewhere just past the edge of hearing, voices were singing and calling her by name and asking her to come just a little closer. Only the children, they said. Only the children. She never had been a child again since the day she first heard the story. And so, she said, she was safe from whatever waited up that hollow. So here's the real question. Was Hollister Vance right that something in that clearing has been luring children in for over 2 centuries? Or is there a simpler, sadder explanation buried underneath all of it? A well-meaning teacher who made a terrible mistake, a geological quirk that just happens to sound like a human voice, and a community that could never quite forgive itself for what it failed to stop. I want to know what you think really happened in Ashcombe Hollow. Drop your theory in the comments below. And if this kept you hooked until the very end, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next dark corner of forgotten history we dig up. I'll see you in the next one.